All right, folks, welcome to the first Sunday service of 2025, right? Crazy. Yes, woohoo. We started the book of Daniel last week, so this is where we will be for the next few months. I mentioned last week the structure of the book. Basically, half of the book contains these stories, one in each chapter, almost for the first 6 chapters. And then the latter portion of Daniel, you will see kind of some crazy stuff that we'll get to. These visions, these dreams, prophetic things that happened, came to fruition in their future, but our past, but also certain things that are yet to come in our future. So whenever those come up, we'll definitely spend some time on them. But for now, these stories are relatively straightforward. These narratives that are pretty familiar to all of us. I mentioned VeggieTales last week, so likely all of these were included in one episode or another of VeggieTales, so everyone, including the kiddos, they're familiar with these stories. So let's go ahead and get started. In Daniel chapter 2, we will not go through the entirety or the whole story, so I'll stop basically halfway, since it is a rather long narrative here. So we'll go through the first 23 verses of Daniel chapter 2. So Daniel chapter 2 from verse 1 to verse 23. And much like I did last week, instead of reading it all the way through and just going back, I'll do a portion at a time. We'll pause, consider what was just read, and then continue throughout. So let me just read to you the first verse of this chapter. And it says here, "Now, in the second year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams, and his spirit was so troubled that his sleep left him." So here, again, a very well-known, famous story about dreams that Nebuchadnezzar, who was at this particular time in history the most powerful human. Here it gives somewhat of a chronology, a historical chronology. It states that it was the second year of his reign. There are some chronological problems or difficulties with this statement, partially because of other texts that give account to kings and when they took charge or when they became kings after their parents' death, usually their father's death. And also within the content that we've already covered, we know that Daniel and his buddies, they were sort of kidnapped and taken into Babylon. To be trained within the Babylonian Empire, to be part of Nebuchadnezzar's court of advisors and wise men. And that training took 3 years. But here we have a situation in this next account that it says it's Nebuchadnezzar's second year reigning, so that there's a little bit of a conflict with that. It's not that important. Things that you will see in commentaries or maybe notes if you have an annotated Bible of sorts. And there are a few ways to deal with this issue. Very likely what we have here is a situation that was very common, where a king would take that role coinciding with his father's last few years. So there will be a little bit of an overlap and a parallel reign of sorts. And then eventually this new king will take charge on his own. So here, very likely, it was Nebuchadnezzar's 4th year reigning, but his 2nd year doing so alone without his father, who by now had already died. And once again, now we are introduced to this story. A story about this king that had dreams. As we go through the narrative and the details contained in the story, it is evident that these dreams were very impactful. And all of us, have dreams. Some of them more impactful, noteworthy than others. I usually don't remember my dreams, or if I do, I'll remember it right when I wake up, and then you get busy with life, and then you forget about them. But here, it was something abnormal. It wasn't just a dream, and it wasn't just an impactful dream. It was something that Nebuchadnezzar knew needed to be explained. It tormented him. It drove him crazy. He could not rest because these dreams were so impactful and powerful. And if you are literally the most powerful human on earth, you have resources. You're going to try to figure out what gives. Why are you having these dreams? What's the meaning behind these dreams? What can be done related to these dreams, at the very least, so you can sleep? Because again, if you're rich and powerful, what's the use to have all that money, those resources, if you cannot at least get a good night of sleep? At the very least, but there was more to this. He felt that it was something that needed light to be shined upon. He needed to understand the meaning behind these dreams. So because of this context, now we have the demands of a person who, again, is quite literally the most powerful dude on earth at this particular time in history. So let's get through the second verse, verse 2 to verse 9. And it says here, "Then the king gave the command to call the magicians, the astrologers, the sorcerers, and the Chaldeans to tell the king his dream. So they came and stood before the king, and the king said to them, I have had a dream, and my spirit is anxious to know the dream. Then the Chaldeans spoke to the king in Aramaic, O king, live forever. Tell your servants the dream, and we will give the interpretation. The king answered and said to the Chaldeans, my decision is firm. If you do not make known the dream to me and its interpretation, you shall be cut in pieces, and your houses shall be made an ash heap. However, if you tell the dream and its interpretation, you shall receive from me gifts, rewards, and great honor. Therefore, tell me the dream and its interpretation." Verse 7, they answered again and said, let the king tell his servants the dream, and we will give its interpretation. The king answered and said, I know for certain that you would gain time because you see that my decision is firm. If you do not make known the dream to me, there is only one decree for you have agreed to speak lying and corrupt words before me till the time has changed. Therefore, tell me the dream, and I shall know that you can give me its interpretation. So what does the most powerful dude on earth do? He calls his subjects. Very likely these magicians, these Chaldeans, these wise men, and astrologers, they were part of his father's court, and now they just transitioned into his court and his subjects. So these were people that were relied upon in the past to give advice, to give insight, to interpret things such as dreams. So he rallied them up and he asked them this pretty straightforward question. He said, look, I'm having these dreams. These are very impactful dreams, and I want you to tell me what the meaning of these dreams are. Now, the wise men, being wise, they said, no problem. There's a note here on verse 4 that states, the Chaldeans spoke to the king in Aramaic. And here I'm just going to open a parenthesis that will eventually be closed. But it is an interesting fact that the book of Daniel, along with portions of Ezra, but especially Daniel, there's a large, significant chunk of it written in Aramaic. So the book starts out in chapter 1, all the way to chapter 2, verse 3, written in Hebrew, like all of the other Old Testament books in the Bible. From this fourth verse of chapter 2, all the way to the end of chapter 7, it's all written in Aramaic. And then from chapter 8 all the way to the end of the book in chapter 12, it's written in Hebrew again. So it's a Hebrew sandwich. No, it's an Aramaic sandwich with Hebrew buns. Again, not very common in the Bible. Ezra, the prophet Ezra, there is certain content that is also in Aramaic, but there he was quoting certain decrees that were written in Aramaic directly. So this is different, where the story is literally, in the original, it's literally being documented in this very foreign language. Now we know, most of us are familiar with the fact that during Jesus' time, the common language, the language that was spoken, was Aramaic. Aramaic originally was the language of the Babylonians, and then it just kind of continued to the point where it became just a common language during Jesus' time. The New Testament was written in Greek, but again, very likely when Jesus was just speaking to people and his disciples, they were having these dialogues in Aramaic, okay, even though they also knew Hebrew, but Hebrew was not usually the language that was spoken throughout. We don't know why. We don't know the significance of it. It might be stylistic. There may be another reason for it, but just FYI, nice parentheses for us to deal with, and now said parentheses is closed. So here, interestingly enough, as they are starting to speak with the king in Aramaic, now the language totally changes, and now it's being written in Aramaic in the original text. So, again, being wise men, they come to the king, to Nebuchadnezzar, to this greatest and most feared and powerful human on earth, and says, "No problem, king. Tell us your dream, and we will interpret it." Being that this is Aramaic, it's actually, I don't want to say that it's harder than Hebrew. Hebrew is very hard as well. But certain terms, certain words, they're especially difficult to translate in our modern translations. So, from verse 4 to verse 5, again, the servants come and they ask, "Give us the dream, and we'll interpret it." And then the response of the king is this, on verse 5. The king answered and said to the Chaldeans, "My decision is firm." Now, the term there that is utilized and translated by "my decision is firm," or something that is similar depending on the translation or version of your Bible. This is the New King James Version. The NIV will have something similar to that. But in other versions or other translations, you get something like, "The thing is gone from me." I think the old King James Version, not the new one, the old one has, "The thing has gone from me," which is drastically different. And those are just the things that you have to deal with when you are translating an ancient language, and certain resources are just not available to us. And often you just base the translation with context in mind. But again, it's very limited as far as what can actually be done with certain terms, because we just don't have access to a dictionary from this period of time just listing exactly what said term meant. The reason why I'm pointing this out is because there are two ways to interpret what is happening here. The one The first way is the usual way. It's the way that you hear in VeggieTales. It's the king trying to make it really hard upon his subjects, these wise men, and telling them, hey, I got a dream. I want you to interpret. But you are not going to fool me, because I know I've been hanging around you guys for a very long time. I know how you guys function. If I tell you my dream, you will just make up an interpretation. And how will I possibly know if it is true or not? But I did not get to my position because I'm a fool. So here is what I'm going to do. I've told you I've had these dreams, and these are very intense dreams. And you, being wise men, you being these magicians, these Chaldeans, these astrologers, you being in your position for a very long time, you worked under my father, and you were part of his council, and you advised him, and you interpreted things, and you worked doing this type of stuff for a very long time. If you are who you claim to be, then you don't need me to give you the dream. You will not only interpret said dream, but you will actually tell me the dream without me telling you what that dream was. One way to interpret it. Another way to interpret it, based on, again, the translation, is the simple fact that Nebuchadnezzar did not remember, which happens. I alluded to that a few minutes ago, right? Sometimes we wake up and we know we had a dream. Maybe we're like sweating, our heart is pumping. It just seemed like real. It seemed like real life. You know, maybe right before you fell off a cliff or peed in your pants, you woke up. And then you forget what happened, right? You knew that it was impactful. You knew that it seemed very real, but you forgot. So it might be one or it might be another. But regardless of your interpretation, what we see during the narrative is the fact that God was either directly or indirectly putting these wise men to shame. He was either directly doing so by providing this intense dream to Nebuchadnezzar, the most powerful man on earth, who could not sleep. So naturally he'd be grumpy. So God either directly did this on purpose, not allowing Nebuchadnezzar to remember his dream, so his request was going to be specially difficult. Not only do I want the interpretation, I can't even remember the dream. So you got to give me the dream as well. Or, indirectly, God utilizing Nebuchadnezzar and Nebuchadnezzar's, willingness to slaughter a bunch of wise men just for the sake of proving his point. One way or another, again, God was behind this. But going back to the narrative, going back to the story, essentially, they were charged with a very, very difficult task, an impossible task. They needed to not only interpret, but they also needed to give the content of the dream. So there's no lying involved here, right? There's no way to scheme your way out of this. Either you are who you claim to be, or you are not. And if you're not, it's not just a matter of you getting demoted. You're not just going to get fired or shunned. Nebuchadnezzar was not playing around. They were going to be killed. He was cleaning house. Again, maybe he was just fed up with all of these people that worked under his father when he was king. Maybe he noticed certain things that he did not want to be repeated during his reign, or just maybe he was just grumpy because he could not sleep, but had all the power in the world and could do whatever he wanted, and he chose to do this. Either you tell me, and you are going to be blessed. you are going to be praised, you are going to be rewarded, or if you don't tell me, you're going to be slaughtered. It's one or the other. So, obviously, these wise men, they were worried, right? They were scared for their lives. They were literally being threatened. And there is no way to sort of scheme your way out of the situation. So they tried to dialogue with the king a little bit. Again, their role was a role of advisors of sorts. You know, they claimed to have these supernatural abilities, but these abilities were utilized for the purpose of advising the king as to, you know, what to do in certain situations, right? And this was just one of those situations where they needed to inform the king of something. So they go to the king and try to carry out a cordial exchange and dialogue. So in verse 10 to verse 11, here's what they say. So the Chaldeans answered the king and said, "There is not a man on earth who can tell the king's matter. Therefore, no king, lord, or ruler has ever asked such things of any magicians, astrologers, or Chaldeans. It is a difficult thing that the king requests, and there is no other who can tell it to the king except the gods whose dwelling is not with flesh." Basically, they told Nebuchadnezzar that his request was unreasonable. They raised objections, and the objections were more or less threefold, or they gave three reasons for their objections. First was the fact that he could not expect a man bound by earthly limitations to be able to do what he was requesting. One thing is for you to interpret content. Another thing is for you to try to figure out what that content was. And they said, no man can do it, which is the reason why no king has ever asked this from anyone. The only people, person, thing that can do this, it's the gods. And the gods are not going to come down to earth, be amongst us to tell us what the interpretation is and what the dream was. Ironically, right? We know that God literally did that. That was not their intention to foretell what was to come, but that was part of their argument. Very likely, it was based upon this idea of you know, the polytheistic understanding of different rankings of gods, where these magicians, these Chaldeans, these are astrologers and wise men, they had access to certain spiritual beings, gods, if you will, that kind of roamed the earth. But these were not the highest ranking gods. The highest ranking gods were way above, and men did not have access to those gods. So they were saying, the gods that we have access to, the spiritual realities that we are able to maneuver around, to manipulate, to access, unfortunately, they are not able to do what you are requesting. It is way too hard, way too special. Only those way up high can do it, and they're not coming down anytime soon. So these are the reasons for the objections that we have. Now, Nebuchadnezzar has time to respond. Again, there's a dialogue happening here. So from verse 12 to verse 13, he says, "For this reason the king was angry and furious, and gave the command to destroy all the wise men of Babylon. So the decree went out, and they began killing the wise men, and they sought Daniel and his companions to kill them." The king had enough. He was not going to be manipulated by these wise men. They were hired for this purpose. If they claimed to be wise men, have these supernatural powers, they should have been able to answer the question and provide the information that was being requested. And here they were just kind of fumbling around, trying to argue their way out of a tough situation, trying to buy time, right? That's what they were doing. And Nebuchadnezzar, again, hadn't slept for a while, was furious, was not going to have any of it. So what did he do? Okay, you're not going to answer. You're not going to provide what I'm requesting. Why do I need you around? Why do you need to be here? You will be destroyed. You will be slaughtered. All of you will be killed. I will literally clean house. So that was the decree. That was what was happening. The guard in charge of these types of procedures started going around the city of Babylon, killing off all of these wise men that once served, under the father and now under him for a short period of time. But here we have a problem contained within the plot line that we saw last week. Daniel and his friends were being tutored, were being trained, were being prepped to serve in a similar fashion. They were wise men in training. And they were maybe not official, but at the cusp of holding positions like this. So it was all a package deal. So when the king made this decree, it affected Daniel, his friends, and everyone else who was in that situation, regardless if, they were the ones having this dialogue with the king or not. The king was going to just wipe all of this caste out and start from scratch, and that involved Daniel. So on verse 14 to 16, Daniel is made aware of this. And it says here, "Then with counsel and wisdom, Daniel answered Arioch, the captain of the king's guard, who had gone out to kill the wise men of Babylon. He answered and said to Arioch, the king's captain, 'Why is the decree from the king so urgent?' Then Arioch made the decision known to Daniel. So Daniel went in and asked the king to give him time, and that he might tell the king the interpretation." So now, again, even though Daniel wasn't immediately involved in this, it was made known. Why? Because, again, wise men were being killed, dropping dead left to right. Eventually, Daniel took notice, right? These were people who he probably related to or with. People that might have even trained him in certain regards, because they kind of ranked a little higher at some point in time, even though now Daniel was already acknowledged as the brightest, the most beautiful, the healthiest, and held a place of, maybe affection even to Nebuchadnezzar, because he realized how special both he and his friends were. But regardless of that, Daniel saw what was happening. And then he went to the captain of the guard and asked, "What gives? Why is it now? We've been here for 3 years, trained to be part of this group. We've actually excelled to the point where the king himself has acknowledged that we are very smart, bright, and deserve a prominent position amongst all of these advisors. And now he's just killing them off? And he's going to do the same to us or with us? What gives? What is happening?" So the captain, being a nice guy, probably just a perfectly nice human, yet had a job to do. In between slaughtering wise men, he took a break, maybe wiped his hands from the blood, as, they're screaming in agony in the background, and had a little meeting with Daniel and explained, "Look, this is what happened. I'm sorry. Nothing can be done. this decree comes from above. It's the decision of the emperor, the king, the most powerful dude on earth. Daniel, very wisely, intervened. Why did he intervene? Was it just because he's a nice guy, want wise men to be killed? Probably, partially, but it mattered to him. He was next. He was in line to be executed. So oftentimes when we, consider a story like this, it's almost like Daniel is being a hero and he wants to save the community of white. He is trying to save his own life and the life of his friends. Doesn't mean that he doesn't care about others, but he knows that he is about to be killed. So what does he do? He requests a time with the king, and we don't know the details as to how this actually happened. Knocked on the king's door, made an appointment, just barged right in. We know from the previous story that, again, he was held in high regard, so he had access to the king in one way or another. And he was granted said access. He was allowed to speak to the king. And what does Daniel do? We don't know the exchange exactly, verbatim. All we know is that, again, he was allowed to see the king, and he requested time, and seemingly time was granted. That's it. That's all we know. He saw the king, either directly or indirectly, asked for more time, so he could do the job that the other people couldn't do, and was evidently granted this time, this extra bonus time, overtime, if you will. So what does Daniel do with this time that he asked? Look what it says from verse 17 to verse 18. Then Daniel went to his house and made the decision known to Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, his companions, that they might seek mercies from God of heaven concerning this secret, so that Daniel and his companions might not perish with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. Daniel asked for time. Why did he ask for time? He asked for time so both him and his buddies could pray. Seek God out. And it's interesting. There is an interesting parallel here between what Daniel did with Nebuchadnezzar and what he was doing now with this extra time. Technically, he went to talk to the king and ask for extra time so he could talk to the king. See how that works? He needed some time to talk to the bigger king. He went to ask the inferior king for time so that he could spend that time, so he could talk to the king, so he could be in the king's presence. He went in the presence of the earthly king so that he could have some time to be in the presence of the ultimate heavenly king. So that's what they did. They prayed, and they prayed, and they prayed. It was a hard situation. Again, they were scared, fearful for their lives. They knew that something miraculous needed to occur, needed to happen, or else they would perish. So they prayed, and they prayed, and they prayed some more. What happened? Verse 19. Then the secret was revealed to Daniel in a night vision. So Daniel blessed the God of heaven. Daniel answered and said, "Blessed be the name of God forever and ever, for wisdom and might are his. And he changes the times and the seasons. He removes kings and raises up kings. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who have understanding. He reveals deep and secret things. He knows what is in the darkness, and light dwells in him. I thank you and praise you, O God of my fathers. You have given me wisdom and might, and have now made known to me what we asked of you, for you have made known to us the king's demand. So after this prayerful time, after asking for overtime, being granted and utilizing this time in prayer, God revealed everything to Daniel. It says here in a night vision, we don't know exactly what that means. It could be in a dream, or it could be as he was praying at night. Very unlikely that he slept. He just had this vision, and it just so happened that the vision happened at night. One way or another, we know, based on the chronology of events and how they are being explained, that this was divine intervention. No one else received this, not even the buddies. They were praying. It came to Daniel. Daniel was selected to receive this very important piece of information. Again, not only the dream, but the interpretation of the dream, which we will take a look at next week. But most of us, more or less knows how the story will end. So Daniel goes, and immediately after receiving this information through this night vision, he praises God. He blesses the name of God. He mentions a couple of things here on verse 20. He's highlighting God's wisdom and might. In other words, the fact that God plans, but God is not just a God of plans. He actually worked those plans out. It's one thing for you to say, yeah, God is a planner. Because, what's the big deal? I'm a planner. Oh, man, I have all of these lists that I wake up to. Hardly ever do they get accomplished. Partly because they're long lists. Partly because I frankly don't want to do certain things on that list. But many, it's because I'm totally powerless. I wish I could do it. I wish it could be done or achieved, but I'm totally powerless. So it just stays in the list. But God is a God of lists. He's planning, but he's also a God of might. He does. He makes it happen. It comes to fruition. He highlights the fact that God, he changes, he removes, he gives. Verse 21 focuses on the content of the interpretation. We'll get to that next week, but here again, the focus is the fact that God is the one orchestrating, regardless if it's a king, someone that has a high ranking. He can just take that person out and put someone else in and replace him with anyone he chooses. He is the sovereign one. And then finally, on verse 22 to 23, Daniel was basically highlighting the fact that not only does God plan and do, but by his grace and mercy, he also reveals. He shares his plan. He welcomes people to participate, not because he needs them, but because he wants them to be part of his plans, and sometimes in such a important and intricate way that they have insight into God's will and mind. Do you grasp the depth of that? Having the ability to have insight into God's mind. One thing is for you to see God doing something. Another thing is for you to know every once in a while why he did that. God welcoming puny human beings into his mind, revealing. He doesn't do it for everything, We cannot grasp God's will in its totality, yet he gives us enough just for us to be in awe. That's what the Bible is, essentially. He opens the door, cracks it open, and we are welcomed into his mind, his will, his desires, his intentions. It's just a little crack. The opening is ever so slight, but it's still amazing, miraculous, unbelievable. Daniel's saying, amazing. You reveal things. You communicate your will in a way that is understandable to our limited, puny little brains. Unreal. So this is where we're going to stop the story for today. Eventually we'll get to the actual content of the interpretation. But here I want to close by highlighting something contained in this story. And this is kind of what we'll do. I did that last week, and I will do it this week, and we'll continue to do it in the coming weeks. Again, a very well-known story. Most of us are very familiar, so, the content is not avant-garde, right? Nothing that probably you haven't heard before or thought of. But I do want to highlight one thing that I thought was special about this story, regardless of its content. There's an interesting comparison between Daniel and these other wise men. In one way, they were very similar. Again, they were kind of doing the same thing. Daniel was a wise man in training, probably already achieving, a ranking that made some of the other ones jealous, but was taught to do the things that wise men do. So in that sense, they kind of worked in the same department, if you will. All had access to the king at some point or another. They were submissive to the king. So the king required them to do things, and they needed to do. All those things were very similar. All were put in a similar situation of danger. The original, group of wise men here, the Chaldeans, the astrologers, the magicians, they were fearing for their lives. Why? Because they knew that Nebuchadnezzar was not messing around. Daniel? Pretty similar. Again, he wasn't here just trying to save other wise men. He was trying to save his own life and the life of his friends. You better know for sure that he was scared to death. A normal human experience. And when both Daniel and the group of wise men, when they replied and responded to Nebuchadnezzar's original request, they did so also in a similar way. Let me go back to what is said here on verse 8. Then the king answered and said, I know for certain that you would gain time because you see that my decision is firm. Time. Again, they were trying to bargain, reason with the king. They were trying to gain time. What did Daniel do? Exactly the same thing. Daniel was trying to gain, that was literally the reason why he went to talk to the king. First of all, to explain, hey, I think I can do it, but I need time. Give me some more time. Allow me the time. Again, the comparison, the parallels, evident. What's the main difference? While one group of people was utilizing time just for the sake of delaying the inevitable, right? That's what they were doing. They knew that they would die. They knew that if the king did not change his decree, that they would die. They couldn't do anything about that, so they were delaying the inevitable, trying to buy some time. The king got furious because he caught on. Killed them anyways. Time has expired. Daniel, he was also dealing with time. He was also utilizing time, but in a different way. He was investing that time with something, with someone that was timeless, for the purposes not bound by his immediate circumstances, even though it affected, even though it mattered. Time was being utilized with someone and for purposes that were beyond that situation. The fruits of it were beyond. And that's something similar that we all struggle with and deal with. All of us have time. All of us, everyone, inside and outside of this room, has the same amount of time. 24 hours in a day. We don't know how long we're going to live. The inevitable will come. How will we use our time? Is time just going to be used to delay the inevitable? And what I mean by that is, the inevitable will come. Isn't that true? It's going to come. Are we going to be like the group of wise men that were just trying to buy some more time until the inevitable came? Or are we actually going to utilize, invest time, whatever time we have, for purposes that are beyond our circumstances, conditions, this timeline that we are bound by and stuck in? Prayer is a great example of this. It's not the only example, but it's a great example, and it is the example that is most obvious here. Time that we spend relating with God is time that is not lost. It is time that is invested. It is time that will literally have fruits not bound by time. Things that will have repercussions for all of eternity. The closeness, the relationship, the gaining of intimacy. What will you choose to do with your time? I'll leave it at that. Amen.